Well, welcome. Thank you for showing up tonight. And if there are more people who are going to come in, that's great. I do have it auto joining, so it shouldn't be an interruption or anything of that nature. Yeah, as Jesse said, my name is Joe Rankin. I'm the head coach at Bettendorf High School from Bettendorf, Iowa. And we're going to be going through the Dog of War LD topic discussion for the November-December topic. And I'm going to share my screen here now, and hopefully that will work out just beautifully, and we'll go from there. So let's see right here and share. All right, so yep, there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and say slideshow and from beginning. And so we should be good to go. All right, so yeah, I'm going to see if I can put up the chat. Yeah, if you do have a question or anything that pops up while I'm going through this, just because of the way the screen is set up, if you wouldn't mind just like if you have the camera on, just like physically raising your hand or something, just so I know, or feel free to interrupt, that kind of thing. I'm going to go through things not for the intent of every single word and every single syllable to make total sense. I'm going to be going through things a little bit quickly so that way we can have some Q&A at the end. So if you do have any big questions, I would, wait for that. But if something does pop up and I blaze through it or something and it doesn't quite make sense or you want me to explain it, feel free to just unmute or raise your hand in some way, shape, or form, so that way I can see that. I am going to keep the pictures over here on the one side of my screen so I can see your camera if you do have it on, and we'll go from there. So this is the LD topic overview for November, December 2025 as part of the Dog Award Debate Institute as we go through things. So click here, you silly little goose you. There we go. All right, so first and foremost, always good to just make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm going to tell you the LD topic. This is the United States ought to rewild substantial tracts of land. And in case you aren't familiar, Esther and Alex, this is a topic that you can vote on. The NSDA does allow students to vote as well as coaches. And this particular topic for November, December was voted on by 892 coaches and 3,056 students, and it was won by 54% of the coach vote and 52% of the student vote. So that really does say how close it was in terms of like the two different topic areas that were decided upon. This was the winner, and they do this every single topic revision. So if you wanted to be part of this, you just have to log into your NSDA account. I believe it's basically the last week of November when this takes place for the voting, and you can have your say and get your vote cast. And those options are already out there for the January, February topic, which for the most part around the country will be the LD topic for the rest of the year. So it's kind of a big deal for the next topic, especially. But if you do want to, you can see that your vote does matter because this was a very close vote. And so, anyway, well, the very first thing that I like to do, and this is a big shout out to Jet Smith on YouTube as well as some other places out there. That's just a really good starting point. But the one thing that I like to do that he advocates as well is just looking at the topic and making sure we understand what kind of topic it is. Because in LD, there are a number of different ones. And this particular topic is considered a policy topic. And the reason for that is broken down on the screen. First of all, you have to look at it and say, who is the actor? So what is the clear idea of who is trying to do what in the resolution? And so when you look at it, the United States is the start of the sentence there. And so the United States ought to rewild substantial tracts of land. So we have the actor as the United States. And for the most part, that typically means the federal government. There will be some topics where some different teams across the country might break that up into state actions and those kind of things. But for the most part, that usually means the federal government. So it's going to be that as the actor. So the government has to be the person in control of doing things for the most part here. And what are they trying to do? Which is ought, which is suggesting what the actor should do. That's a very common thing in Lincoln debate. We're not saying we're going to put out a stop sign outside or we're going to take a stop sign away. We're more dealing with like, should we or should we not do something? And so like, is that something we have the right to do? Is it something that ought to be done? Is it a moral action? That's going to be a whole crux of this topic. And then finally, it does have an action, which is rewild. And we're going to go through those definitions a bit here on the next few slides, but that's what the actor has to do. And so in this case, by default, the resolution has a clear actor who should consider doing something, in this case, rewild, and that is basically telling you to do a policy action. And so the United States government will be advocating for something to be done, in this case, rewild, and we're going to go through what that means. And one little note there is to the word ought can also refer to a moral action of right or wrong, whether it's our ethical duty to do something or not. Just like we may be able to save the life of a kid who's going to get hit by a bus, but is that our ethical duty? Do we have to do that, or is that just an option? That's one of those things that we're going to consider as we go through. And so the first thing in Lincoln Douglas debate, especially for beginners, I always recommend is to go through definitions and to make sure that you understand what the topic is doing. And there will be times when the affirmative side of the debate will define things differently than the negative side of the debate. As debaters, you're going to be having to do both sides of the resolution. Usually a tournament will go through an even number of affirmative rounds as negative rounds. So you do have to defend both sides. It's not whether you love the topic as a person or not. It's what you can prove in the court of law kind of thing. And so just to start us off here, I do give you four different definitions of rewild that you can at least look at and kind of see, get a feel for the distinction. And I did give you the sources, so these are pretty easy to find if you wanted to look up Merriam-Webster, Cambridge, Oxford, Collins. These are all very common definitions. But just to look at the distinct differences here, because I don't know about you, but when I heard about this topic, I didn't initially know what the heck rewild meant, right? That isn't a common term you hear. And so here's Merriam-Webster's definition, and it is to increase biodiversity and restore the natural processes of an ecosystem, typically by reducing or ceasing human activity and reintroducing plant and animal species. Now, that's pretty deep kind of stuff, right? Like to increase biodiversity, so we want to have more types of plants and more types of animals. Restore the natural process. I guess that means rainfall. I guess that means, like this is what's going through my head as I'm reading this definition. And the part that really gets me there is the reducing or ceasing human activity, right? So in my head, does this mean, and this is just the initial thought frame that I would recommend you kind of do as you're thinking about this. Does this mean like the city of Bettendorf where I live, like we'd have to like cease human activity and like leave to reintroduce plants and animal species? This is where my brain goes at first. But this is why we have to get the definitions down and then maybe look at the history and go back through things. But right now, just trying to look at the definition basis. The second one says to protect an environment and return it to its natural state, for example, by bringing back wild animals that used to live there. So now there's that historical feature, right? Like in Iowa, there used to be wolves that wandered these lands, and that means we have to bring wolves back. And return it to its natural state. That kind of does also imply, again, that idea that we have to remove human nature or human structures that are currently here in order to meet that definition. At least that's on face that I'm reading. And then rewild here to return land to a wilder and more natural state, kind of the similar above. Obviously, they're going to be similar, they're the same word. But see the different nuances here. And then finally, to rewild an area of a land is to return it to a similar to, I guess the windows here blocking me a little bit, sorry. To return to a state similar to the one in which it was in before it was intensely cultivated by humans. And so when you're going through the definition analysis, before we even get into the history, I want you to get a feel for how that's different than just like doing conservation efforts or just focusing on like bringing more greenery back to the environment. These definitions are very, I don't want to say anti-human, but there is a part of that where it is reducing or ceasing human activity or returning it to a natural state or a wilder and more natural state. There's that theme there that is very, like anti-human or anti at least progress kind of vibe. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more, substantial tracts of land, because substantial means considerable in quantity, significantly great, large in size, of ample or considerable amount. And so when I'm thinking about this, I realize that, okay, I've seen some rewild efforts like locally in urban neighborhoods and stuff where like, oh, we're going to take that backyard that isn't being used and just let nature take its course or something of that nature. That really isn't in my head when I'm thinking about this topic because it says substantial tracts of land, which means large areas, which means large, well, large areas of land, large quantities. And so, what does that mean exactly? In Bettendorf, when I'm walking down the street from from the school I work at to my house, if I were to walk home, there's a neighbor in our neighborhood who does have a backyard that says this is a wildlife reclaimed zone or something of that nature. Is that really a large tract of land, though? Well, for his home, maybe, but for Bettendorf, no. And so you really have to think about what this means. Tracts of land means all land owned by the applicant participant in a single parcel. This one definition I found, an identifiable portion of land that is often very large, 640 acres. And so there is a number there that's a very like concrete number, but this is not dealing with just a small amount of space. And so one of the examples that isn't of the picture that just was trying to show different tracts, but the spine of the continent Wildway is an example of a substantial tract of land that's a huge stretch of like federal land that is owned by the federal government that they could rewild and just let go in terms of like nature. So when you're thinking about the topic, I think it's always good, especially in Lincoln Douglas debate, to know the definitions because you're kind of like lawyers in the courtroom, and your goal is to make sure that you are being specific enough to be, topical and focused on things. In terms of this resolution, a few of the core concepts that you probably should be thinking about, especially after you get past the definition level, or at least kind of go like, hey, what the heck do those words even mean, are the background. And so there are some core concepts to rewilding, and some of them include, but are not limited to, like you can there are different people with different, belief systems, those kind of things. But generally speaking, disallow fishing, hunting, or harvesting. So we're not going to do any of that on this land because that's humans going in and taking over. That's bad. We're going to stop that. We could also remove barriers like dams, fences, and roads. And so even though right now that big area I just talked about, the spine of the continent, that may mostly be open space or federally protected parkland right now, but it still has roads, it still has fences, it still has different dams to control the water, it still allows some hunting or harvesting, or that would be why it would still qualify for rewilding because we still have those human elements in there. The least offensive one on this topic is the benign neglect. And I kind of think about this when I walk home from school a few times too. In the house that didn't clean out their gutters and they have stuff growing out of the top of their gutter, like little trees from those little helicopter things that come out of the trees and stuff. That's what I think. And I'm like, no, that's not benign neglect. In fact, it's probably just a valuing the home value as well as the neighborhood's value. But benign neglect would be let's just let the ditches on the highway keep growing and just let it go naturally instead of like going through and mowing and stuff of that nature. Planting depleted native plant species. So, like, we know that this area used to have this plant. Let's just replant it and let it grow wild and fertilize as it would naturally. We could also reintroduce highly interactive species like beavers and wolves. That's a huge part of this topic in order to protect those wildlife or at least let them resurge and stuff. And then there's this three-word concept thing that came from the original people who created this idea of rewild in the 1980s, whose names are on the next slide, I believe. But that is cores, corridors, and carnivores. And cores are the area of land without human intervention. And so let's just say they wanted to take a big section of Iowa that's rural, which is most of it, and they would say this is the core area that we're going to introduce um, the carnivores into, like we're going to repopulate wolves, or we're going to repopulate bison, or we're going to repopulate beavers, or something of that nature. And the core would be the land, the carnivore would be the creature, and the corridors would be the things that connect those two. So we have to have some way that uh, those creatures, the carnivores, have to leave that core area and move on to a different core area because it has to be a substantial tract of land and it has to have that ability to move around. So it's not quite a zoo, it's not quite a expansion of that kind of nature, but it's meant to be open. And in the end, there are two different kinds of rewilding that are pretty commonly found in the literature. Trophic rewilding, which is active reintroduction, that would be actively putting the wolves in or actively putting the species of plant back in. And then there's also the passive, which just allows nature to take back over where it was previously man-made. And so if you've ever seen any of those like fantasy sci-fi series things where like a city is like abandoned and left to like regrow vegetable, that kind of stuff, that would be a reclaiming of man-made stuff. In terms of other core concepts here, we do have some keystone species that are often found, and this is what a great deal of the literature is on about if you're looking into the rewilding, if you're looking at different kinds of species. They would be wolves, beavers, and bears. Like wolves are the ones, at least in our area, that are pretty commonly talked about in order to reintroduce the natural predator kind of back to the environment. Um, but if you haven't gotten that vibe so far, this is a relatively radical ecological idea. It's not just conservation. It's not just like, hey, let's try to protect the planet or let's restore wildlife to this area. It's kind of a little bit beyond that. That's why it's its own term, rewild. It's a little bit more extreme than just like, hey, save the planet. Let's put some scarves on some trees or something. This is a bit more than that. And so the can't one of the things that a lot of these philosophers who do believe in this kind of talk about is that the land can't be rewilded until it's unwilded, meaning we have to remove those human beings because they're kind of the problem. We need to get their stuff out of there. So, even if you did have a big expanse where it just had like one, I don't even know about one, but like let's just say there's a ranch on a big open part of land that's, 20, 30, 40 acres, that would have to be removed in a lot of these circumstances because you want to humanize the place before you rewild, that kind of thing. And that's what leads to some of the conflict on this topic. It leads to some backlash because there are farmers and ranchers who are out there trying to make food or trying to raise cattle of some way, shape, or form for humans. And if we have to remove them, well, that's kind of anti-human, and that's not really helping us get a food supply or help us get, all kinds of stuff in terms of food supply. There's also a bunch of stuff that's tied to water protection because there's a lot of different things that if we got rid of human beings in that area, the water wouldn't be polluted as much. One of the things in Iowa that I don't know if we're famous for or anything of that nature. But in Des Moines, they had a big tech company come in and did a bunch of stuff because they had this great company that they wanted to have a lot of computing power to power this thing. Maybe you've heard of called Chat GPT, and they put this factory in, and then it started making the water like really bad for fish and warmer, and started killing things. And then they were really mad that they gave the company that access. What do you do? But it's closely tied to water protection. If we got rid of companies and stuff, we would have less pollution, and then the beavers and the animals would be safer. We've had a lot of biodiversity loss, just species that have died out because of the stuff that we've done in a particular area. And climate change is usually also a product of that too. And so when you're looking at that, you might see conservation, which is protecting existing species. You might see stuff about restoration, where human managed efforts to return an area to historical states. But in the end, what we're actually talking about on this topic is rewilding, which is emphasizing restoring of natural processes and self-regulation. So you can see that those concepts are all kind of similar. They all want to protect something about the planet in some way, shape, or form. But rewild goes a step further by making it all about the natural process and making sure the process itself regulates itself. And so if you did want to look up a little bit more specific detail about each of these people, these are the ones who founded the rewilding ideas in the 1980s, 1990s. And so if you looked up John Muir, who's a conservation philosopher, uh, Aldo Leopold, land ethics, they're the people that kind of started the whole idea of rewilding. And then it went a little bit further with Dave Foreman, Michael, I don't know if that's spelled right. That's probably just misspelled. Sorry about that. Sol and Reed Noss in the 1990s. But those are the people that, if you're looking for that philosophical or starting point for the idea of rewild, 1980s, 1990s, that's where it's at. But in terms of the topic area, you're probably going to find a bunch of stuff here that talks about the stakeholders. So these are people who actually are impacted by this directly. Those would be farmers, wildlife companies, rural communities, fossil fuel industry because they're mining the ground and that can kind of disrupt the environment, animal and plant species, and indigenous people. And so I do have a little bit of a breakdown there where farmers have to give up their land because it's used for human use. Fossil fuel companies have to remove drills and place things elsewhere because otherwise it's going to be interfering with this rewilding effort. And then, generally speaking, animal and plant species are impacted both positively and negatively by removal or growth, because if we have to remove this plant because it's not native and replace it with this plant that was, and also we have just indigenous people because who has the right to the land in the first place? A lot of the times in America, especially, it's private land. We do have federal land that we have as well, but these efforts are probably going to impact both worlds. So there are a few different concepts here before we actually get into some of the evidence that you can choose to utilize in this topic area. Some of it comes down to land sparing versus land sharing. So can we spare the land, meaning get out of it entirely and let it be on its own? That would be the goal of rewilding. Or is there some kind of way that we can share the land, meaning we don't have to rewild it because we are going to still be utilizing that land and not harm it in the way that has traditionally been the case for most people, to say that, it's really bad for us to do that. You could also look at restoration versus conservation. We talked about that a little bit before. Can we restore nature to what it was? I mean, is it even possible? Do we even know what nature was like before human started interacting? Or has the environment changed so much that it isn't going to really be good for us to restore it? Like if we just said Bettendorf used to have a whole lot of wolves here, if we just put a whole lot of wolves here, would they actually be in the same environment they were before humankind started or not? Because there's been a whole lot of change to that area, be it through just structures that were built, or, water that was redirected, or land, that has just been totally changed because of what we've built or mined out of the area. It's kind of hard to say that we can restore nature in the first place. Or do we just conserve what we can from here out because the damage is already done? I think the Wall-E movie of that one, if you think about it, right? Like we had to destroy the planet in order to figure out how to space travel and leave, and then we came back with a boot with a growth in it, and we decided we could like invigorate the planet. Or do we have environmental protection versus development? Is the goal protecting the environment more important than developing what we have so far? So that's a very human centric or not human centric kind of way. Does the planet deserve to be on its own? Or have we already like used it in a certain way and we should continue because, we're the top species, top dog, and we should have our say kind of deal. So what I've given here, and you're going to have this entire PowerPoint, you're going to have a packet of information that Jesse's going to send out here before the weekend out. But what I have here, and all of these are clickable that you can check out on your own, but These are things to help you get a feel for the topic. And I always like to do that because the more topic knowledge you have, the more understanding you get of it. But here are, articles you can just click on and it'll open up on its own window. This is a 6 global success stories of how rewilding key species can rebalance an ecosystem. And so that's from various parts around the world. Since this topic talks about the United States, there are a couple of examples from here that are United States specific. So those are probably the best parts of evidence that you're going to use because it is our country with our rules and our guidelines and those kind of things. But there are also going to be things here like Rewild Argentina, how that entire country went through here and did something similar on that front, and so on and so forth. But all these links are going to be available that you can check out. They are pretty high quality in terms of like research, good sources, those kind of things. But that's what you kind of want when you're in Lincoln Douglas debate. You want to have something with some depth and some understanding of it. But I thought that would be good. And these would be great things to cut cards from. But for right now, I just put them on there. You can look at them later and go through it. And one of the things I do recommend when I'm going through this with my own students is I always say like, hey, let's make sure we have a clear understanding of the topic, what ideas work for the AFNEG, and then just break things down into claim, warrant, impact. And I do have a document there that you can check out that just kind of goes through how to set up cards. But like what I did with my students is I had them go through these articles and try to find some stuff that would be good for a case. And so those are just starting points for you to check out, and it'll have some like bare bone basic stuff there to help you start off. But before we get to that, we're just going to go through the rest of a Lincoln Douglas case. And there are two stances at least for the novice level Lincoln Douglas debate that I would recommend you start from. And that is the value. And so the value in Lincoln Douglas debate is just what you think is the most important concept in the round. And for right now, I just trying to boil it down to two big stances. And one is morality and one is government legitimacy. There's all kinds of different values. You can look at all kinds of different things as values in Lincoln Douglas debate. But the two that kind of stand out the best, at least for starting points for novices to me, would be morality, which means what ought to be done, where you can focus on an ecological or ethical concern. And it's usually best for the affirmative. And I do have some cards that are linked right there too. It's going to be a Google Doc that you can check out that just kind of has some justification for how morality works. And so, generally speaking, you're looking at the big value focus, which would be why do we do things, or why do human beings have to look out for ourselves, or why do we have to look out for the planet? Those are some justifications there. And it can go down into two kinds of systems here for the most part. Ecocentrism, which means the entire ecosystem has intrinsic value, meaning the planet itself does have worth, and we should kind of like respect that. Or you can look at an anthrop anthrop anthropocentrism point of view, which is meaning a human-centered valuation. So like this planet doesn't mean a dang thing unless it serves me in some way, shape, or form. Like it doesn't matter to me if we have grass or not. I just want to make sure I have a home to, put my house on and stuff, or property to put my house on and stuff. Then there's this idea of government legitimacy, which the topic is about the US government making some decisions. And you could focus on a lot of different things, but one thing is a very rights focused perspective, like a libertarian saying, I have certain rights and certain responsibilities and such of that nature. And it's usually best for a negative starting point, but there are some cards that are going to be there too to help you out. And you could look at this from an environmental justice point of view, like there's a certain amount of things that needs to be done in order to be fair. Or you could do a restorative justice kind of system where we need to not rewild, or we need to rewild because it's going to restore justice to a certain group of people or a place or a thing, and those kind of deals. But those are the two big values. In terms of criterions in the round, if you're in a traditional Lincoln Douglas style, it is usually a value and a criterion setup. If not, it's still a standard that you're looking for in weighing the round. And these are standards that kind of work in those systems. And so if you wanted to look up morality from a Kantian point of view, you would respect human dignity first and foremost. If you wanted to look from a John Stuart Mill perspective, you might maximize expected well-being of people. Andrew Linklater, fulfilling one's duty to avoid harm. Ross, fulfilling one's fundamental duties. And so as you can see, there's just a bunch of different concepts you can look at. But when you're doing a traditional value criterion contention style case, this just gives you a starting point to look at and to consider different points of view. For government legitimacy, you might protect citizens or maintain just institutions, resist government intrusion, or ensure consistency with the Constitution. Those are just, again, different concepts you can look at. And again, it says there at the bottom, not your only options, but just some ideas to start exploring. And so as you're going through your case writing, I usually recommend picking a stance or picking a viewpoint and then trying to making sure every single argument you make in the round connects back to that idea. So that would be what would be considered the framework, the definition, the value, the criterion, and that is how you're framing the debate. Before you start talking about it to your judge, you need to establish exactly what it is and what the most important idea is, the value, and how you achieve that value through the criterion before you get into the contention level offense, which is the proof that you're going to offer up to say that this is actually true in the real world in some way, shape, or form. Which brings us to the affirmative arguments, and I'm going to give you 5 of them here. I'm going to just go over them very briefly, and then each of the next slides has 3 of these arguments that has some evidence that you can check out and you can cut cards from in order to help out. And so just as we go through this, just think like big picture stuff. This is what the affirmative generally can argue on this topic. There's more arguments than this, there always are, but these are the 5 that I think would be good starting points for your affirmative case writing. So, first and foremost, it's your ethical responsibility to protect nature. There's going to be a decent amount of arguments on the topic that would just say that human beings have kind of like destroyed the planet in different ways, and it's now our responsibility to rebuild biodiversity because life is worthy of respect. And there's going to be a bunch of arguments that say if we don't do something about it, like really bad things happen. So, in terms of that, that's really what we're going for here, the ethical responsibility. The second argument is just climate change will decrease CO2 emissions. Like if we don't do something now, the planet's going to die in some way, shape, or form. And that's the carbon sequestration, absorbing atmospheric carbon. You could also be focused on improving water quality. Like right now, the water is really bad and we're dying and getting infected diseases and all these kind of things. Where if we use keystone species like beavers, it'll help protect our basic needs. You could reduce wildfire risk. Right now, federal land, I think, accounts for like 60–70% of wildfires or stuff of that nature in America. And if we rewilded, as weird as it sounds, to like let nature take its course, a lot of times those natural defenses will make it harder to have people die in, big fires like in California because of, wildfire risk. And again, we have this restore and protect biodiversity. That sounds like the same argument as the first one, but the first one is really the ethical responsibility. It's not necessarily just about like it's good for the planet, but the first one's like it's our duty, morally speaking. And the last one is like, hey, here's the nitty gritty details. This will actually help biodiversity. And so the next few slides here just go through some arguments again that you can find and research on your own, cut cards about. But as you can tell from the article title, these ethical responsibility to protect nature arguments here are here's a ethical considerations for wildlife reintroduction and rewilding. So that article talks about how we can't just like put the animals in a certain area and just let them go. We have to do certain things to help and make sure that they survive. And that's our ethical duty if we're doing such a thing. And then they have some principles on how it goes, and they have some other nature-based approaches to help with climate change. So each one has a little bit different stance on things, but if you were to go through them, you probably could make a case pretty quickly on this topic on that front. This one goes through the improving water quality front, and it goes through the water cycle and how this kind of would function in terms of the real world through the real rewilding perspective. But it goes through different restoration programs that have actually happened in the past. So that's really good to show how it is feasible on the actual real world front because it has been done before. And it can actually do some pretty crazy things too. Like the last article there, the role of rewilding and mitigating hydrological extremes, state of the evidence. And so if we do rewild, it will, there are a bunch of different claims out there that it'll stop, not stop global warming, but significantly slow or stop climate change or that kind of nature. And some of these articles have some decent evidence that you can dig through and find. And the final one here, remember only you can prevent wildfires, is that rewilding landscapes with rhinos and reindeer could prevent fires and keep the Arctic cool. I gotta love those claims when it goes straight there, but they actually have some evidence that goes through. Here are times when it's been introduced, and here's how it functioned. And then we have 2 other articles there that just talk about how big fires, just like I said earlier, about how there's so much federal land that is on fire in different times. This kind of goes through and how you can prevent that simply by rewilding. And so those articles would be really good proof that you could do if any of those arguments make the most sense to you. I would pick your poison and kind of go with it. And negative side of things, which we have good idea, bad idea, we have some other arguments you can make. And so here are 5 that are big picture items. And then just like the affirmative, I did focus on 3 and gave you some links on them. And so one thing, as hard as this is to believe, if we were to just take wolves and put them next to Bettendorf, Iowa, I'm going to tell you those wolves are probably going to bite some people and eat our livestock or do some things, right? I don't think we'd have too many loose pets in the Quad Cities anymore if we allowed wolves to just like roam outside the area in a corridor connecting to another core area or something of that nature. And so that one's pretty easy to think about. Like if we introduce these apex predators and large carnivores, we're going to have some safety issues. Pretty easy peasy one to probably think about. Danger to agriculture, same kind of thing. If we introduce this, livestock are going to die. The ranching we could do is gone, and it'll harm our agriculture because it's going to destroy the farmland. Offshoring environmental harm. That is where, if we stop doing it here, that just means those companies will go elsewhere. And if they go elsewhere, that means they're probably going to do even worse things because they probably don't have the same government that we do that tries to at least somewhat protect things. One of the arguments I do explore here in just a second, invasive species. So if we allow wildlife or rewilding to occur, we have unknown and unexpected outcomes because of invasive species. And so just because we let one animal in, it doesn't mean they're also not going to carry in new, bugs and other things of that nature, causing all kinds of harm. So the screwworm is one of the fun ones coming up from Mexico right now into America, which are really bad mojo things. The hornet bee was one of those things that came across the sea that was really bad and kind of almost took over everything. It's kind of crazy. Then we have violating property rights, which is a classic, and you can find a whole lot of non-rewilding evidence out there to say that property rights are pretty important to Americans, especially, and we shouldn't violate people's rights. So in terms of this, we have some apex predators picture there anyway, and these are kind of the ones that we're trying to bring back. And predator, there's 3 articles there about the implications of rewilding apex predators for plant-animal mutualisms. And so it's just one of those things like big words there, but predation risk can modify the foraging behavior of frugivorous carnivores. Well, if we introduce a bear back into an area that doesn't have bears anymore, I'm pretty sure it's going to change how the wildlife lives. Duh. But it's a pretty big article that goes through how reintroducing even just one species can really change that environment. And I mean, it makes intuitive sense, but you are going to need some evidence that kind of points that out and tells us what the actual impact is. That's what some of these articles do. We also have in the UK where they reintroduced the lynx, and we have how the apex predator is not a quick fix for restoring ecosystems. Here's a 20-year study. And so they actually went through and reintroduced something 20 years ago. And here's an article that talks about how that hasn't really changed things as much as they thought it would. And so that could be mitigating or at least a rebuttal evidence minimum. Then you have some invasive species stuff here. And so what are invasive species? It goes through the zebra mussel is a real bad one in terms of like ships and how they've come over and really taken over. And if a invasive species like that comes over doesn't have a natural predator here, they kind of like just take over. It's really bad stuff. Then we have other articles there about how this all works, and especially the last one there, open border ecosystems against globalized laissez-faire rewilding. It's just talking about how you can't just let the free market kind of roam and do this. It's going to like cause some harm in the big picture. And then finally here, we have some violating property rights arguments. And this is interesting. It's not America because we haven't done this quite as much in America as other places have done. But this is 3 different articles from Britain where they did have rewilding done in different ways across the country and how this affected not only the government, but also private landowners like farmers and other landowners and how this changed things. So it's really good as a case study to see how human beings reacted to these changes being kind of forced upon them. And then, in the end, what you're going to be doing here is you're going to be taking all this stuff and putting it together. And I say Voltron assemble. You're probably too young to know who Voltron is. Greg would have known who Voltron is. I'm sorry. But in terms of things like you're going to be making a case with definitions, a value, a criterion, contentions. And in the end, your goal is to make a 6-minute affirmative case, a 3 to 4 minute negative case. And then once you've gone with your coach and revised it and made sure it all connects together properly, then you're going to be moving on to rebuttal prep, which would be the arguments that your opponent might say, how you'd respond to them. But the first goal I always tell my students is we have to write cases first. And we're trying to do that right now as we're preparing for the mini apple competition here this upcoming weekend. I've got 2 or 3 cases I have to read on this topic to see how they're doing on this thing. And so that goes through the lovely PowerPoint. Now let me go through one more thing. Jesse's going to be sending a different version of this. He has an updated version, but let me just kind of tell you what you, Alex, and Esther are going to be getting here after tonight. You're going to be also receiving, what's behind door number 1, Alex? A starter pack of things, and this isn't quite done. This Jesse has an updated version of this, but you're going to be getting some starter LD stuff about some basic case writing stuff, but also some affirmative evidence and a whole bunch of different arguments and some negative evidence and a whole bunch of different arguments. And so you're going to be getting this PowerPoint. You're going to be getting all the links that are in the PowerPoint, and you're going to be getting a whole bunch of evidence that you could utilize as you see fit to write cases and get ready for the upcoming season for competition. But that is my spiel about the LD topic. And so what we're going to do for any remaining time, which is 15, 20 minutes, probably minimum, is we're going to allow you, Alex, or you, Esther, or Jesse, for that matter, if he so wants to chime in, to ask any questions you have, or if anything didn't make sense, or if you want me to go deeper into things, or maybe open up some of those articles and look at them. We can do any of those things, but I am here to serve you.
Well, Joe, that was phenomenal. Thank you. One thing that I'm really big on, and this goes back to my degree in history education, is I really like looking at the historical implications or why, like what has been done in the past. So, like in the United States, like I look back to like some of the earliest concepts of rewilding. And one of the ones that at least jumps to my mind came about because of this little thing in the 1920s. Let's see if we have any history fans out there. Anyone know the biggest agricultural and ecological disaster of the 1920s?
I'm going to say Dust Bowl.
You are correct, Dust Bowl. And the reason behind the Dust Bowl was yes, it was a drought, but really the drought was the last, like, was the straw that broke the donkey's back or the camel's back. Um, we wouldn't have had a Dust Bowl that was nearly as bad if we hadn't ripped up the central U.S. for farming. And so you had all this land that had been torn up, natural grass roots have been ripped up. And that's one of the things that in Iowa we don't necessarily we take for granted is that when you drive by a field or when you look at pictures, and I'm using Iowa as the example, any place in the Midwest where you have like these luscious, like rich grasslands, whenever you dig up those roots, you don't realize that those roots aren't like your standard topsoil. Okay, I can't, you stick a spade in your yard and you pull up a little plot of soil and then you hit bottom soil. Um, that's not really the way it works in the Midwest. Like you stick a spade in the ground and you're still hitting root. You could hit roots going down 15, 20 feet. And that's why our topsoil is some of the best because it not only as the roots die do they decompose and then fertilize, but also they hold the soil really well. And so when we as farmers cut up all of that grassland for farming, we left it exposed. And exposed land when it dries out really fast, and then the winds picked it up and threw it. The second biggest disaster we had in terms of farming came in the late 19 came in the 1920s as well, the late 1920s. Largest economic cataclysm in the U.S. history. What would that be? Anyone for those history-minded folk?
I already got the Dust Bowl. Sorry. I feel good about myself.
Yep. Anyone biggest economic? It was known as it was great.
Oh yeah, I already knew this
The
one.
Great Recession.
Yeah, Great Depression. Great Recession was 2000s. Great Depression. Yep, and that's when the prices of that's when many things happened. It was a chain event, but the stock market collapsed. But what caused it was the fact that farmers in the Midwest had their crops, whether it be dairy, whether it be sorghum, soybeans, oats, corn, didn't matter. There was so much of it being planted so fast that all of this land or that all of this crop was being taken to market. The crops being taken to market because there was so much flooding the market, the price per bushel or the price per gallon or the price per pound, however the commodity is weighed, dropped like a rock. And so all of a sudden, instead of having, 50 bushels that you could make $100 profit on, you had 50 bushels that you were barely making $5 profit on. And that caused the price of the commodities market to drop, which meant then that farmers could not sell back their land, couldn't have any profit, meaning that they couldn't pay off the loans for the land and for their equipment that they had bought, which meant that the banks that had given them the money to make these loans in the first places were losing money, causing a cave-in. So the United States post Great Depression, post Dust Bowl, implemented a series of what was known as I keep wanting to call it rewilding projects, but they weren't. They were essentially land pauses, Where the government, if you own, so if Alex owned 1,000 acres of land, they would pay Alex, you know, to not farm maybe 30 of those 30% of those acres, so 300. And they would pay you every year to just let them be natural, to replant grassland and let them be natural. And by doing this, they ensure that there would be some land that would still be kept as a buffer zone against drought. And the second is that there wouldn't be this flood of commodities on the market, so that crop prices would not dramatically crash. And so the U.S. government's already done a project like this. We just didn't call it rewilding. And I look back. The last thing I wanted to chime in on is that we look back on, reintroduction of animals. And as Joe was bringing this up, the one thing I think about is, again, Iowa. We have it out west where they've introduced wolves and they haven't done so well. I'm thinking about around Yellowstone and in Alaska. You have situations where they have succeeded. For instance, you have the Great Beaver Drop is a really cool example to look up, where the U.S. Army paradropped dozens of hundreds of beavers into the Pacific Northwest to help rewild them, primarily because they needed to stop the flows of rivers from flooding. But I look at it in a negative way, or at least a negative example would be in Iowa, where back when I was in high school, back in many years past, back in the 2000s, when the DNR in Iowa tried to rewild mountain lions into the state to help control the deer population. And as it so happened, one of the mountain lions that was rehomed was right near my house. And it ended up, almost going after my neighbor's young children. It was only scared away because I took a wild shot at it and missed, but scared it away. And here's how how well it worked in Iowa. They put in 10 breeding pair, or they put in 5 breeding pairs, so 5 male, 5 female, and out of those 10 mountain lions, 7 had been killed in the first year, either through hunter action or by being hit by cars. So not really a great return on investment in that case. Now that's just an example of where rewilding has failed, and honestly, it probably failed mostly because the government failed to tell the people about it. So, but that comes with rewilding, is that you also have to trust your government to communicate with you the true intentions and what they're doing. So, so I'll turn it over to everyone else.
Yeah, Esther and Alex, if you have any questions, feel free.
How does the fact that it's a policy motion impact how we argue versus if it was just a basic one about morality?
It's just more about your approach to the topic, and I don't really think there's especially depending on where you're debating and those kind of things, it doesn't matter too much. It just opens up different types of arguments. So in terms of a straight value debate where you would say hey, we have an ethical duty to do X or Y, should I save that baby or should I let the baby die, or those kind of things. That would just be a moral implication, a ethical consideration. It wouldn't be necessarily a government action though. So this type of argument, not saying you should or should not make these kind of arguments, but in a policy style argument, you could be getting to the point where maybe the United States federal government shouldn't do it, but Iowa state government should. Or maybe the United States federal government shouldn't be doing it, but the wildlife refuge effort can. So just because it's more of a negative opening up of strategy more than anything else. Because you could be making different actors do things. It could be the wrong action because rewild isn't right, but conservation is. There's just different layers of the debate that you open up when you just specify what kind of topic it is. And it's not to say that there's a right or wrong, because it's just different styles of debate. For instance, where I'm at, a local tournament will be probably more likely to do the ethical kind of argument. Whereas if I went to the tournament that I'm going to this weekend in Minnesota, they're going to have everything goes. And if I'm not ready or understanding how that difference in approach works, then I'm going to be at a disadvantage. And
Yep.
so that's kind of what it means. So it doesn't really have a huge implication for you understanding the topic, but it does have you what arguments you're preparing your brain to handle. If you just go in there with just the blindsiders to say ethical arguments, and maybe in your part of the country that's the only argument you're going to hear, but if you hear someone from somewhere else, all of a sudden you're going to be like, I'm sorry, what? What are you talking about? Right?
Well,
So that's why the implication.
Well, and Alex, so I've actually worked with some students out of Oregon. Actually, I worked with the 2-year national qualifier out of the state of Oregon. I get your Washington, but your debate cultures are relatively similar. Um, so the one area where I see this being more of a focal point in your neck of the woods up in the Northwest is the fact that a policy-based motion or a policy-based resolution in this case, not only does it do what Mr. Rankin talked about in terms of like opening up the styles of argumentation, you could have it in, I'm sure Mr. Stevens has talked with you about this, the idea of like what kind of plans and counter plans can you run on this? He's talked with you about that. I see a nod. Um, so not only does that open it up to you, but in the Northwest, it also opens it up to the idea that if this is a policy-based motion, then it also opens it up to then not only just the morality of an action, but the morality of the action as seen through the eyes of the government. So what would moral governments do? And this goes back to what Mr. Rankin was talking about with like the social contract theories and, this definitely opens it up to like Rawls's, duties of government. So that's where you might want to go with it. Again, I'm more familiar with like the California, Oregon side of things, but you may want to take a look at like the ethics of government and what should ethical governments do. You almost want to, in essence, role play this as though you were in a legislative body and you were either voting for or against this bill. What would votes for this bill on the affirmative have to say? Like, what would their arguments be and why? And what would the negative be? Because and it's one of those cases. And your old coach actually taught me this when he was in Iowa. Fun fact: when he judged me at one of the first PF tournaments in the country and gave me a 25, a justified 25. He was totally right. I earned every ounce of that. But one of the things he taught me is that both sides of a debate can be true. The rewilding can be both good and bad. Eating an extra cookie at dinner can be both good and bad. The question is through what lens do you view it? So that's where you should really go with like how you view the concept of like a policy based.
All right, thank you. Yeah, no, he's added in stuff about that. Like my criterion on the neg is minimizing structural violence. So
So you said the neg criterion was minimizing structural violence.
yeah, it
Interesting.
most yeah, the way I've built the case so far is mostly centered around settler colonialism, not turning it into like a full-on critique, but just like
But
if you have this,
okay,
yeah,
so it's like the idea of rewilding in the first place is just another form of colonialist power.
yeah, and there's also
Okay.
cards that say like if you take like if you say this land nobody can go on anymore, that's going to exclude indigenous like practices, their culture, and their current economic and uh like stuff that they're doing.
Well,
So
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, the whole idea of the topic, like if you think about it, no matter what, if I just go, this land right here is now rewilded, that's still man saying that land is something different than what it is right now. So it's a full on, no matter how you slice it, it's going to be a full on anthro, case.
Yep. Well, and that goes back to like the fact that like what was it? I believe in the 80s or 90s, the federal government ruled for the I want to say, man, my history brain is going to be kicking me until I look at it. I think it was the Blackfoot tribe out of South Dakota. They won their lawsuit challenging the government for an illegitimate taking of the Black Hills area, and so the government put like billions of dollars in like a savings account for them to claim. Their argument is we don't want the money. It was never about the money. It was about the fact that we want the land. So like you could argue that like, yeah, we've rewilded the land. Look, it looks exactly as it did right before westward expansion. It's like, but yet the native tribes that were living here during westward expansion can't use it. Like we still get arrested by the Bureau of Land Management when we set foot on it. Like where's the like you've done nothing except just you've changed a different flavor of your power. Esther, I believe you are a newer debater. I know that in the past, Kennedy has not had a lot of LDers, at least not since like the days of Andrew Shea back, in like 2000, like pre-pandemic era. You're a new LDer. What questions do you have for us?
Well, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can hear you.
Okay. I guess one thing would be currently our coach, well, I don't know. currently our coach isn't super experienced either. So I was just wondering, what's the ultimate goal when you're in a Lincoln Douglas debate?
To win. I'm just kidding. Calm down, calm down. But you're just trying to prove, like, think of it the way that I, typically say to brand new students or coaches is think of a courtroom setting where you have a prosecutor and you have a defense, right? And you have a judge. Think of an LD round like that. It's a very technical place. Like you're not going to walk into a courtroom and go, "Yo, judge, what up?" Right? Like you're not going to be talking informally. It's going to be very formal language. It's going to be very specific language. It's going to be very legal focused language. And you're going to try to prove a very particular thing in a very technical manner. So, like when we're talking about this rewild topic, we're not just going to be like, yo, go hug a tree, right? Like you have to prove very specifically with very clear evidence, with, just like in a court of law, we don't just go like, yeah, that knife, it's kind of bloody. I bet it killed the man. Like, no, you have to like have fingerprints. You have to have like stab wounds, you have to have analysis, you have to go through things, you have to prove it very specifically, because you're innocent until proven guilty. So if you're going to be prosecuting someone in court, you have to go above and beyond the shadow of doubt in order to prove a case. So Lincoln Douglas debate is a 1v1 event where one person is trying to prove the topic true, the other person has to say the topic is false, and you have a judge in the room who is going to be the expert, or at least in debate, maybe not on rewild, right? But an expert on debate, like a judge would be, and they're going to determine the winner. So in the end, your goal is to prove your side of the debate, despite the other side trying to sabotage you in every way, shape, or form, right? Like you both, it's not just enough for you to say McDonald's is a good place to eat and Alex to say Burger King is better. You have to have some clash. You have to tell me why one is better than the other and give me a reason to do one action over the other. That's the ultimate goal of LD.
Yep, and I think, and it's more like it's when it comes to the idea of clash. Just to add on to that, it's that everything is viewed through, like every debate event has a different certain lens that you view it through. So Congress debate would be viewed through a certain lens, and PF through a certain lens. Like Lincoln Douglas should be viewed through a philosophical lens. So go back to the original, I guess the original, the OGs of Lincoln Douglas, Lincoln and Douglas in the Illinois Senate race, that they were, when they were debating the morals and ethics of slavery, they were doing so not necessarily, not sometimes, but not necessarily focused on like the economic concerns. They were focused in on like the worth of a person as an individual, and do slaves fall into that category? So it was debate, but not in the way we would see it. So like in the way that you would see like the public forum debaters at Kennedy arguing about like how many people would be affected by this and who would die in a nuclear war from this, and how many people, how many how many dollars would be saved by this. You're looking at it in terms of like the philosophy of the issue. So like in terms of rewilding, if we rewild and we put wolves back in their natural habitats, or we put a bunch of beaver back in theirs, or we put, thousands of acres of wildflowers out there, what can, like, how does that fit in with some ethical or moral framework that our government, that we value or cherish? So everything you should be saying is kind of backlit by this like moral or ethical concern.
I don't know if that helped or not, Esther, but we tried. But yeah, if you or your coach have any questions, I mean, not saying know everything by any stretch of the imagination, but have done this for 21 years and he's not that far down the road. So happy to help. Um, happy to help. Okay.
And just to kind of give you, Esther, I know that and I may not have made it any better to what when I jumped off of what Mr. Rankin was saying. One thing that I think will help you is when I send out this packet, and everyone, again, once I get back to my home and my computer, I'll bundle up everything that Mr. Rankin has put together and the packet that the Dog of War has put together, and we'll send it out. Esther, one thing that I would encourage you to do is to look through, there are sample debate cases in there. Take a look at those, and those will kind of lay out a little bit about how, at least how an LD structure should be. The best thing I can tell you right now is just to learn as much about the debate format, debate in general, to learn about clash and impact and writing good arguments. Everything else after that, is kind of just putting everything into like a new form fit pan.
All right.